There is a particular kind of grief that has no funeral, no casseroles brought to the door, no condolence cards stacked on the kitchen counter, no one sitting beside you and saying, I am so sorry for what you lost. Because what you lost was not a person. The person was right there, in the next room, at the dinner table, tucking you in at night sometimes, loving you in the ways they could. What you lost was something harder to name, something that doesn't show up on any death certificate. What you lost was a childhood, and the world never gave you permission to grieve it. You grew up in a house with weather inside it, not the predictable kind, not the kind where you check the forecast and dress accordingly, the kind that shifted without warning, where you learned very early to read the air before you read a book, to study the sound of footsteps on the stairs and know, from the weight and the rhythm alone, what kind of night it was going to be. You became a small, exquisitely sensitive instrument, tuned not to your own needs, but to the emotional atmosphere of someone else entirely. And you were a child. You were supposed to be drawing pictures and scraping your knees and being gloriously, obliviously absorbed in yourself. Instead, you became a caretaker, a monitor, a translator of moods. You grew up fluent in a language no child should have to learn. That was not your fault. But here's what you must hold. It shaped you in ways you are still discovering. Mental illness wears many faces in a household. It might have been depression so heavy it pinned your parent to the bed for days. And you learned to move quietly through the house, to not need too much, to make yourself small enough that your needs didn't add to the weight already pressing down. It might have been anxiety so consuming that the world outside your door became a map of dangers, and you inherited that map. You still carry it, unfolded in your chest even now. It might have been the volatility of untreated bipolar disorder, the fog of schizophrenia, the cycling chaos of addiction wrapped in mental illness, the slow erosion of a personality disorder that made love feel conditional, confusing, given and then suddenly withdrawn for reasons you could never fully decode. The specifics differ, but the experience, the emotional texture of it, is startlingly consistent across all of them. You never fully relaxed. You never fully trusted that safety would hold, and somewhere along the way you stopped expecting it to. This is not weakness. This is adaptation. To understand what happened to you, we have to stop looking at the symptoms you carry as an adult and start looking at the architecture of the house you were built inside. The human brain in childhood is not finished. It is being constructed in real time, and the primary building material is relationship. Specifically, it is the relationship with a caregiver. What your nervous system needed, what every child's nervous system needs, is something researchers call co-regulation. It sounds clinical. The felt experience of it is simple. You needed someone who was regulated enough to help you regulate. You needed, when you were scared, a presence that communicated through tone of voice, through touch, through steady eye contact. You are safe. I have you. The world is manageable. That is not a luxury. That is how a child's brain learns to self-soothe. That is how the architecture of calm gets built. But your parent was fighting their own war inside their own mind. They were not always able to be that steady presence. Not because they didn't love you. Many of them loved you desperately, painfully, completely. But love does not equal regulation. Love does not automatically produce safety. And so your nervous system, denied the raw material it needed, built something different. It built hypervigilance instead of security. It built anxious scanning instead of calm curiosity. It built a self that was extraordinarily attuned to other people and almost completely unacquainted with its own inner life. Because your inner life had to wait. There were more urgent things to attend to. But here is the complexity you must hold. The child you were did something remarkable. In the absence of a stable external world, you created an internal one. You became resourceful in ways that still serve you. You became emotionally intelligent, not as a gift, but as a survival tool honed by years of necessity. You became someone who can read a room in seconds, who notices the subtle shift in someone's voice before they've said a word, who is often the person others come to in crisis. Because you have always known how to hold people in their worst moments because you had to. You are capable and perceptive and surprisingly resilient. None of that is nothing. None of that should be dismissed. But here is what you must also hold. That same attunement, that extraordinary sensitivity to others, came at a price. The price was you. The price was the version of you that never got to be simply, unguardedly, loudly a child. The version of you who played without one ear, always angled toward the sound of trouble. Who cried without worrying whether your crying would make things worse. Who needed something, comfort, attention, reassurance, and simply asked for it without first calculating whether the asking was safe. That child existed, briefly, and then the house required something else of them, and they learned to put that child away somewhere quiet and get on with things. And that child is still there, still waiting, still grieving the years that were spent attending to someone else's storm. Psychologists call the role many of you played parentification. It is the process by which a child takes on emotional or functional responsibilities that belong by developmental right to the adults in the household. And research on parentified children is consistent and clear. The long-term effects are not small. They show up in adulthood as difficulty identifying your own needs. Not just expressing them, but identifying them. As chronic guilt around prioritizing yourself. As a peculiar discomfort with receiving care, because receiving care was never safe, never guaranteed, sometimes weaponized. As a pattern of choosing relationships where you are needed rather than relationships where you are simply loved. You are comfortable in the caretaker seat. It is the only seat you were ever taught to sit in. Being cared for feels foreign, almost suspicious, like waiting for it to be taken away. And there is something else. You may have spent years, you may still be spending years, managing a specific and corrosive form of shame. The shame of the child who believes at a level far below rational thought that their parents' illness was somehow connected to them. That if you had been easier, quieter, better, less needy, somehow things might have been different. Children are egocentric not out of selfishness, but out of developmental necessity. The child's brain is wired to make the self the center of explanation. And so the child in a chaotic home does not conclude my parent is unwell. The child concludes something about me has caused this, or something about me is not enough to fix this. That belief, wordless, pre-verbal, lodged in the body, often survives decades of intellectual understanding. You can know with your entire adult mind that your parents' illness had nothing to do with you, and still feel in certain moments the old familiar weight of it, the sense that you were somehow not quite enough to save them. You were a child. It was not yours to carry, but you carried it anyway, because there was no one else. Here is where it gets harder to say and more important to hear. The grief you never processed has to go somewhere. Unfelt grief does not disappear. It relocates. It shows up as a low-grade anxiety that has no clear object. As a numbness you can't quite explain when good things happen. as an irritability that flares around people who seem to have had easy childhoods. A flare that's followed immediately by guilt because you love your parent, because it was not their fault, because they were sick. And how dare you feel anything as indulgent as anger or grief or longing for something different? And so you press it back down and it relocates again, and the cycle continues. This is not a character flaw. This is what happens when a child is handed a wound they were never given tools to heal. The good news, and there is good news, though I will not rush us to it, is that the wound can be tended, not erased, not resolved into some clean before and after story, but genuinely, meaningfully tended. What the research on adult children of parents with mental illness shows us consistently is that the single most transformative thing is not therapy alone, not understanding alone, not even time alone. It is the experience of being in a relationship, therapeutic, romantic, platonic, it can be any, where you are allowed to have needs, where your needs do not destabilize the other person, where you ask for something and the response is not chaos, withdrawal, or burden, but simply, yes, I have you. What do you need? It is in the deepest sense a reparenting, not of the child you were, that child cannot be retrieved, but of the part of you still braced for the weather to change. And here's the reframe I want to leave you with. You did not have a lost childhood because you were unlucky, or because the universe is cruel, or because your parent did not love you. You had a lost childhood because a very sick person needed more than a sick person can give, and a very small person stepped into the gap and gave everything they had. That is not a story of damage. That is a story of a particular kind of courage. Raw, untrained, instinctive, the only kind a child knows how to offer. You were not failed by your own weakness. You were shaped by an enormous weight placed on someone who was not yet strong enough to hold it, and you held it anyway. The work ahead of you is not to become someone different. It is to slowly, imperfectly, give yourself back the things that were postponed, the permission to need, the right to rest without guilt, the capacity to let someone else hold the weight for a change, and to stay in the room long enough to let them. That child who learned to make themselves small, to need less, to scan and predict and manage, they kept you alive. Honor them, and then gently let them know the emergency is over. You can put it down now. So I want to ask you something, and I want you to sit with it honestly. When someone in your life offers you care, real care, steady care, no strings attached, do you let it in? Or do you find a way, quietly, almost without noticing, to redirect the conversation back to them?